Hi everybody, my name is Kayla Nett and I am a senior history major at Framingham State University, and the project I am going to be presenting on is entitled Heads Will Roll, the Guillotine, the Shifting of Enlightenment Ideals, and the Language of Violence During the Reign of Terror, 1757 to 1794. These are just some key terms that will pop up again and again in my presentation and in my paper. I'm not going to go into detail explaining them just for the sake of time, but you can of course pause and read a little bit about them if you'd like to. But the four terms I have here are guillotine, enlightenment, reign of terror, and sans-culotte. So these were the two main questions that sort of guided my research. As I'll explain in the next slide, the guillotine was developed with the intention of making punishment more equal and in general more painless for the condemned person, but above all I was really interested in the effects these public guillotine executions had on the people who watched them, because they were these huge public events. And then also, as I'll discuss later, the guillotine was certainly not the only source of bloodshed during the French Revolution. The other major example that exists is these popular uprisings that happened quite frequently. So another thing I was interested in looking at was any connections I could draw between guillotine executions and popular uprisings. All right, so now I'm just going to provide some very brief background. First, starting out with one thing I was really interested in looking at in terms of primary source material was text written by Enlightenment thinkers. And the major one that I looked at was the 1764 treatise on crimes and punishments, written by the Italian Enlightenment thinker Cesare Beccaria. He's on the left on my slide. And he has produced probably some of the most well-known and most important Enlightenment critiques of the death penalty in general. To quote from him, he claimed that every punishment that does not derive from absolute necessity is tyrannical. And although Beccaria was someone who was advocating for the abolition of the death penalty altogether, the Enlightenment, one of the hallmarks of it, at least in terms of capital punishment, was people looking for ways to make capital punishment more equal and more painless. So if capital punishment had to exist, I guess they were looking for ways to kind of make it more egalitarian. And that is where Dr. Joseph-Ignace Guillotine comes in. He is the person in the middle. He was a physician and anatomy professor in France. So in 1789, Dr. Guillotine wished to propose a method of execution through which, quote, suffering would be mitigated, and he also believed that punishment should be uniform despite the status of the condemned, because in Ancien Regime France, the punishment you got often depended on your social status. The same goes for lots of other places in Europe. Nobles were often decapitated because it was generally quicker and believed to be more painless, whereas the most merciful, I guess if you could say that, punishment that was afforded to commoners was hanging. So on June 3rd, 1791, the National Assembly voted that every person condemned to die in France should be decapitated. A little myth, a little historical myth, is that Dr. Guillotine was the inventor of the guillotine. While he is, of course, the device's namesake, he actually had very little to do with its initial construction. Dr. Antoine Louis, he was the secretary of the Academy of Surgery. He actually sketched out the design for the first one, whereas German harpsichord maker Tobias Schmidt actually built the very first one. And lastly, the guillotine was inaugurated on April 25th, 1792 in the execution of condemned criminal Nicolas Jacques Pelletier. And something that's really interesting about initial reactions to the guillotine is that the crowds who witnessed Pelletier's execution were initially not pleased with the lack of spectacle, quote unquote. They thought it was too quick. Of course, it certainly was quick compared to the more drawn-out punishments of years past, but of course, this general displeasure among the public would soon change. Other major primary sources for me included eyewitness accounts of guillotine executions, and first and foremost, I looked at accounts of the famous execution of King Louis XVI. That is, of course, him on the left, that very fancy portrait. So he was executed in January 1793, which was a few months before the official start of the Terror. To me, the king's execution marks a key shift in the nature of violence during the Revolution. I think it definitely marks a shift towards using violence to eliminate possible enemies of the Revolution, because with the king's execution, even before his trial, the first calls for his head in the National Convention began in October 1792, and for those who were in support of executing the king, the general argument was that his crime rested in him being a monarch and that his mere existence was an inherent threat to the success of the revolution. And that same type of rhetoric would eventually be applied to other victims of the guillotine. The execution of the king really exemplified people's extreme reactions to guillotine executions. Famously, in the case of the execution of the king, people rushed forward to the scaffold once his head was off for a chance to even touch the royal blood. Some people even tried to dip handkerchiefs into it. After looking at a lot of eyewitness accounts of guillotine executions, it became excruciatingly obvious to me that the role of the crowd was of massive importance, and it contributed to this popular image of the guillotine and its executions providing this grotesque spectacle. When those condemned to die were placed on carts and taken to the place of execution, they were being paraded through the streets. Spectators would often jeer at them as they passed by, and people also often cheered following a condemned person's death. So upon reading this, it really made me question in my head, does this really fall in line with Dr. Guillotine's goal of making punishment more equal? Now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the symbolism of the guillotine, because I really think there's something a bit theatrical about it, and that certainly manifests in some pieces of art that I found. The two left images here are two different artists' renderings of the executions of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, respectively. Looking at these two pieces, I feel like they're portrayed in an almost heroic, kind of stoic, almost angelic manner. And it really seems to me that those sympathetic to the royal family might have even viewed them as martyrs. And these types of images, to me, really gave royalists more ammunition to fight the revolutionaries with, calling them, quote, barbaric and claiming that they were murdering innocent, good people in cold blood. I also think the guillotine might have changed how French people at the time perceived death. In some ways, you could even argue that they might have become a little bit desensitized in a way. To quote from my paper, I say, as an equation, the mix of revolutionary fervor, the inherent symbolism of the guillotine, and the machine's mechanical speed, which meant a demand for more heads, all added up to changing perceptions of death on the part of the French people. In some ways, the guillotine was a little bit of a novelty for the French people. On the right here, I have a picture of some guillotine earrings. That is certainly not the only guillotine-inspired object that existed at the time. There were also miniature guillotines that were used as paperweights. There were even some that were used as children's toys. And children would sometimes use these toys to decapitate dolls or even live birds or mice, which is pretty scary to think about, and some places in France actually banned the toys. And hearing this, you might be asking yourself why, but Regina James, one scholar I cited from in my paper, she believes this sort of desensitivity was because the French people associated the guillotine with their nation's liberation from tyranny, therefore making it, quote, less alien. As mentioned earlier, one thing I was really interested in was any connection that I could make between the popular uprisings that occurred during the French Revolution and guillotine executions. The major connection I see between both of them is how important the role of ordinary everyday people was. In both, you see that these ordinary everyday people, these sans-culottes, their roles really added to revolutionary fervor and really kept things moving. One scholar I cite from, his name was Kevin Duong. He came up with this term called redemptive violence, and in both guillotine executions and popular uprisings, revolutionaries were really taking matters into their own hands and creating justice through bloodshed. So I think that really connects to the term of, quote, redemptive violence. The three major events that I look at in this section are the 1789 fall of the Bastille, the 1789 Women's March to Versailles, and the 1792 attack on the Tuileries Palace. Of course, all of these occurred before the official start of the Reign of Terror, but I still think there is some kind of a connection that can be made between these popular uprisings and the overall shift in the nature of violence that I explained a little bit earlier with the execution of King Louis XVI, you know, the sort of motives behind the violence. And in general, I make the argument that these popular uprisings made justice visible for people who were so yearning to see it amid the injustices that they faced in Ancien regime France. All right, so I guess what now? As we have come to know throughout human history, people have been searching for the most brutal methods to physically punish other human beings. And according to the famous French philosopher Michel Foucault, in his landmark book, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison, these punishments were ways through which governments were able to exert control over their subjects, mainly through their bodies. And although the guillotine was undoubtedly a huge innovation for its time, and it may very well have lessened the condemned person's pain, it still very much falls under Foucault's notion of punishment equaling control, especially in its use during the Reign of Terror. And of course, the French Revolution had a massive impact on the world, especially in the world of politics, and it helped spread Enlightenment thought like no other event before or after it. But its incredible amounts of violence and bloodshed, the guillotine included in that, means it cannot be separated from France's long history of conducting capital punishment publicly. And in closing, to quote from my paper, it is possible to acknowledge the guillotine's improvements upon Ancien regime methods while also taking note of its grotesque horror. Madame Guillotine claimed her final head in France in 1977, albeit behind closed doors. While several nations across the world have abolished capital punishment altogether, France included, the search for a more, quote, humane method of punishment continues, a quest that objectively started with Dr. Guillotine in 1789 and is now more than 200 years in the making.